They thought humans were legends. The enemy celebrated. Then the human dangerous battleships arrived. The sky above Vantor Prime was full of light. Thousands of ships hung in orbit, and each one had its lights turned on in bright colors. Down on the surface, in the great capital city of Nel Ashra, millions of Vantor people filled the streets. They sang old songs. They waved flags with the symbol of the Vantorian Empire, a golden circle with 3 claws. Today was a special day. Today was Humanity Day, the day the Vantor people celebrated the death of their oldest enemy. 30 years ago, the humans had vanished. Before that, they had fought a terrible war against the Vantor and their allies. The humans had been small in number, but strong in a way nobody understood. Old soldiers still spoke about them with fear in their voices. But 30 years had passed since the last human ship was seen. Scholars said Earth had been destroyed in a final battle. Others said the humans had run away into deep space and died out slowly, alone and forgotten. Nobody knew for sure, but everybody agreed on one thing: the humans were gone. And so, every year, the Vantor people celebrated their survival. High above the city, on the bridge of the flagship Ashra's Pride, Grand Admiral Threx Colvane stood with his hands behind his back. He was an old Vantor, with gray scales along his neck and a long scar across his left cheek. He had fought in the Silence War, the war against the humans, when he was young. He remembered things that the young officers around him could not imagine. He remembered human ships appearing out of nowhere. He remembered fleets of 1,000 Vantor warships being destroyed in a single hour. He remembered the fear. But today, he allowed himself to smile. "Admiral," said a voice beside him. It was Commander Doran Vex, a young officer with sharp eyes and quick hands. He was one of the best pilots in the fleet, but he was also known for asking too many questions. "The fireworks display will begin in 10 minutes. The Emperor wants you to give the opening speech from orbit." Colvane nodded slowly. "Tell him I will be ready." Vex did not move. He stood there, looking troubled. "Something is wrong, Commander," Colvane asked. "It's probably nothing," Vex said. "But Deep Space Station Rel 9 reported an unusual gravity reading 2 hours ago. Just a small spike. It came from the direction of the Kesserine Rift." Colvane's smile faded, just for a moment. The Kesserine Rift was the edge of known space, far beyond the last Vantor colony. It was also the last place anyone had ever seen a human ship, 30 years ago, right before they disappeared. "A gravity spike could be anything," Colvane said. "A collapsing star. Debris. An old mine going off." "Yes, sir. That's what Fleet Command said, too. They closed the report." "Then it's closed," Colvane said, but he did not look happy anymore. Vex hesitated, then said, "Sir, may I speak freely?" "You always do, Vex. Go ahead." "I've been studying the old human war records. Most officers don't read them anymore. They say it's ancient history, not useful. But I read them anyway. And there's something in the pattern. Every human attack in the old war started the same way. A small anomaly, a strange signal, something that looked like nothing. And then, days later, the human fleet would appear where nobody expected them." Colvane turned to face his young officer fully now. "You think today's gravity spike is a warning?" "I think we shouldn't be so quick to close the report, sir, that's all." For a long moment, Colvane said nothing. Outside the viewport, the fireworks were beginning. Bright streaks of red and gold light bloomed across the black sky, and the crowds below roared with joy. It was a beautiful sight, but Colvane had seen beautiful skies turn to fire before. "Keep watching the rift," he said finally, quietly. "Don't file a report yet. I don't want to start a panic over nothing on a day like today, but keep watching." "Yes, sir. Yes, sir." Colvane walked toward the bridge's main window, where the whole city of Nel Ashra sparkled below like a field of stars. He thought about the war. He thought about his old friend, Commander Issa Thorne, who had died when her ship was cut in half by a single human beam weapon, a weapon so fast that nobody on her bridge even saw it coming. He thought about the reports from survivors, men and women who said the humans fought like nothing they had ever seen before, calm and cold and terribly precise, like machines wearing the faces of soldiers. The Vantor were not a weak people. Their empire stretched across nearly 400 star systems. They had fought and defeated a dozen other species in their long history. But the humans had been different. In the 3 years of open war, the Vantor and their allies had lost more ships to the humans than in the previous 200 years combined. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the humans stopped fighting. Their home system fell silent. Scout ships, sent to investigate, never returned, and eventually, the Vantor Empire declared them extinct and stopped sending ships at all. Too many had already been lost, trying to find out what happened. Colvane had voted for that decision, back then. He remembered feeling relief when it was made. Relief, and also a strange kind of grief, because an enemy that fearsome deserved to be remembered properly, and instead, they became a footnote, a monster story that parents told their children to make them behave. Humans will come for you if you don't finish your food, mothers on Vantor Prime still said to small children, half joking. It had become that, a myth, a ghost story, not a real thing anymore. Colvane wondered, standing there watching the fireworks, whether that had been a mistake. Down on the planet's surface, in a smaller square near the edge of the capital city, an old woman named Mira Vex, no relation to Commander Vex, though the young officer sometimes joked that they must be cousins somewhere far back, sat at a table covered in old books and data crystals. She was a historian, one of the few remaining scholars who had dedicated her whole career to studying the humans. Most people thought her work was useless now. Why study an extinct species? But Mira did not care what people thought. She had spent 40 years reading everything the Vantor Empire had ever recorded about humanity, and the more she read, the less she believed the official story. She looked up at the fireworks bursting above her, and did not smile. A young student, one of the few who still came to her lectures, sat across from her. His name was Tarn, and he had blue markings on his face that showed he was still very young by Vantor standards, not yet finished with his schooling. "Professor Vex," he said, "why do you look so serious? Everyone else is celebrating." "Tarn, do you know how the humans fought their wars?" Mira asked. "They were strong. Everyone knows that." "No," Mira said. "That's not what I asked. I asked how they fought. Listen carefully. In every recorded battle from the Silence War, the humans never attacked first, not once. Every single battle began because the Vantor Empire, or one of our allies, attacked a human colony or a human ship first. The humans always responded. They never started it." Tarn frowned. "That can't be right. My grandfather fought in that war. He said the humans attacked without warning." "Your grandfather believed what he was told," Mira said gently. "I don't blame him, but I have read the original mission logs, not the summaries written afterward for the public. The war began because 3 Vantor scout ships attacked a small human research station near the edge of the Kesserine Rift, thinking it was an enemy outpost belonging to the Gren Collective, who we were fighting at the time. It was a mistake, but the humans did not know that. All they saw was an attack on their people, and they responded." "Responded how?" Mira's eyes were distant, as if she were looking through the young man and into the past. "They came in ships nobody had ever seen before. Fast, silent. Built from materials our scanners couldn't identify, and they did not stop, not once, until every fleet that had attacked them was gone. Then, and only then, did they retreat back to their own space and offer terms of peace." "Terms of peace, but the war lasted 3 years." "Because the Empire did not accept the terms," Mira said quietly. "We thought we could still win. We thought the first battles were unlucky, that our numbers would overwhelm them eventually. We were wrong, every time, and still, we did not stop. Not until we had lost so many ships that the Emperor at the time finally agreed to end it. But by then, the humans had grown quiet, cold. They stopped answering our messages, and a year later, they were gone." Tarn was silent for a moment, watching the fireworks. "You think they are still out there?" "I think," Mira said slowly, "that a species capable of doing what they did to us in 3 years, a species that never even used its full strength against us, because we never saw their homeworld fall, we never saw their capital, we never truly defeated them in a single major battle, does not simply vanish. I think they went home. I think they rebuilt. And I think one day, they will come back to finish the conversation we refused to have." Above them, the fireworks reached their peak, filling the entire sky with light, and the crowds cheered louder than ever, celebrating a peace that Mira Vex, alone among millions, did not believe was real. Far away, beyond the edge of Vantor space, past the Kesserine Rift, in a region of empty stars that no Vantor ship had charted in 30 years, something moved through the darkness. It made no light. It made no sound that any sensor could detect. It was long and sleek, and built in a shape that looked almost alive, like the hull had grown rather than been built. Inside, hundreds of humans worked quietly at their stations, checking systems, reviewing star charts, preparing for something that had been planned for a very long time. On the bridge of that ship, a woman in a dark gray uniform stood looking at a large display showing the star systems of the Vantorian Empire, laid out in careful detail, more detail than any Vantor could have believed a human ship might have. Her name was Sarah Cole, Fleet Admiral of the Sol Defense Force, and she had been waiting 30 years for this day. "Report," she said, without turning around. A young officer at a nearby station spoke up. "All ships in formation, Admiral. Sensor ghosts confirmed the Vantor detection grid at Rel 9 picked up our gravity signature 2 hours ago, just like we planned. They logged it and dismissed it as a false reading." "Of course they did," Sarah said quietly. "They always do. Comfortable people don't look too closely at the dark." "Should we proceed with the approach, Admiral?" Sarah Cole looked at the star chart a moment longer. She thought about the 30 years since Earth had gone silent, not because they were destroyed, as the Vantor Empire believed, but because humanity had made a choice. After the Silence War, humanity had realized something important. They had won every battle, but they had not truly ended the danger. There were empires like the Vantorian Empire scattered across the galaxy, empires who attacked first and asked questions never, who saw any unfamiliar ship as a target rather than a possible ally. Humanity could keep fighting these wars one at a time, forever, losing good people every time some frightened admiral on some frightened planet decided to shoot first. Or humanity could disappear for a generation, build something stronger, something so far beyond what anyone expected, that the next time a fight began, it would also be the last one. 30 years. 3 full generations of shipbuilders, scientists, soldiers, and engineers, all working in the quiet dark beyond the rift, building a fleet that no one in the wider galaxy even knew existed. Ships built from lessons learned in blood during the Silence War. Weapons designed by people who remembered watching their friends die to enemy numbers that should never have been a threat. And now, finally, it was time. "Proceed," Sarah Cole said, slow and quiet, the way we practiced. "I don't want a single sensor ping until we're ready to be seen." "Yes, Admiral!" The great dark shapes of the human fleet began to move, gliding silently through the space beyond the rift, heading toward a border that had not seen a human ship in 30 years. Behind Sarah Cole, on the wall of the bridge, was a simple plaque, placed there by the shipbuilders who built the vessel. It read, "We do not seek war. We seek an end to it, and we will not stop until it is finished properly, this time." Back on Vantor Prime, the fireworks were ending, and the crowds were beginning to head home, laughing and singing, full of joy and wine and the comfortable belief that their greatest enemy was nothing more than an old story now. Grand Admiral Colvane remained on the bridge of the Ashra's Pride long after the celebration ended, staring out at the quiet stars, thinking about a gravity spike near the Kesserine Rift that probably meant nothing at all. He was wrong, and somewhere in the dark, 30 years of patience was finally coming to an end. They thought humans were legends, the enemy celebrated. Then the human dangerous battleships arrived. 3 days after Humanity Day, the celebrations were still echoing across Vantor Prime. Banners hung from every building. Children played games in the streets where they pretended to be brave Vantor soldiers defeating human monsters with toy blasters. Nobody thought much about the gravity spike near the Kesserine Rift anymore. Nobody except Commander Doran Vex, who had not stopped thinking about it since the moment he first read the report. Vex sat alone in a small office deep inside Fleet Command headquarters, surrounded by stacks of old data crystals. He had requested access to every mission log from the Silence War, all 30 years of them, and his superiors had allowed it, mostly because they thought it would keep him busy and quiet. Nobody expected him to actually find anything. He worked late into the night, reading old reports written by soldiers who were now old men and women, or long dead. He read about the first battle at the Human Research Station, exactly as Professor Mira Vex had described it to her student days earlier. though Doran did not know that conversation had happened. He read about how a Vantor scout squadron, part of a larger patrol hunting for enemy Gren ships, had detected an unknown vessel near the edge of the rift and opened fire without waiting for identification. The human station had been a science outpost, unarmed, studying a strange stellar phenomenon. 12 humans died in that first attack. It was supposed to be a quiet mistake, quietly buried. It did not stay quiet. 4 days later, a single human ship appeared at the border of Vantor space. Just one ship. The Vantor border fleet, over 200 vessels strong, moved to intercept it, expecting an easy kill. The report of what happened next was written by a survivor named Fleet Captain Oren Dask, and Doran Vex read his words 3 times before he could fully understand them. We opened fire the moment it entered weapons range. 211 ships firing everything we had. It did not slow down. It did not maneuver to avoid our fire, not at first. It simply continued forward, as if our weapons meant nothing to it. Then, when it was close enough, it opened fire in return. I do not know what weapon it used. I only know that 11 of our ships were destroyed in the first 4 seconds, each one gone in a single flash of white light. No explosion, no debris, simply gone. By the time the ship turned to leave, 63 of our 211 vessels remained. It did not pursue the survivors. It simply left, the way a man might leave a room after stepping on an insect, without looking back. Doran Vex put down the data crystal and sat very still for a long moment. He had heard stories about the Silence War his whole life, stories told by old veterans in bars, stories that always sounded exaggerated, the kind of things soldiers said to make their old battles sound more impressive than they really were. But this was not a story told in a bar. This was an official military report, filed under classification codes that Doran had needed special permission to access, and it was far worse than any story he had ever heard. He kept reading. Battle after battle, the pattern repeated. The humans never attacked first. Every single engagement in the entire 3-year war began because Vantor forces, or the forces of one of their allied species, attacked a human ship or colony first, usually by mistake, sometimes out of simple fear of the unknown. And every single time, the human response was swift, precise, and devastating, far beyond what the size of their forces should have allowed. By the final year of the war, the Vantor Empire had lost 11,000 warships. The humans, according to the best estimates in the reports, had lost fewer than 300, and many of those losses came only in the final battle, the Battle of Kess Hollow, the largest engagement of the entire war, where the Vantor Empire and 4 allied species had gathered a combined fleet of over 30,000 ships, in a desperate attempt to break human resistance once and for all. Doran had heard about Kess Hollow before. Everyone had. It was taught in schools as a great and terrible battle, a battle so costly that it finally convinced the humans to retreat. But reading the actual mission logs, Doran realized the story taught in schools was wrong in an important way. The humans had not been forced to retreat. They had won the battle. 30,000 allied ships had been reduced to under 6,000 survivors in barely 2 hours of fighting. The human fleet, numbering only around 800 ships at Kess Hollow, had lost fewer than 40. And then, having won completely, having every opportunity to press forward and destroy what remained of the Alliance fleet, and likely march all the way to Vantor Prime itself, the humans stopped. They simply stopped firing, gathered their ships, and withdrew back toward human space. A message was sent to Vantor Fleet Command, recorded in the log Doran now held in his hands. He played the recording. The voice that spoke was calm, tired perhaps, but calm, with no anger in it at all. This is Fleet Admiral Marcus Wren, of the Seoul Defense Force. We have won this battle, as we have won every battle you have brought to us. We did not choose this war. Your forces attacked our people first, and we defended them, as any people would defend their own. We have no wish to destroy your empire, though we could. We ask only this: cease your attacks upon us, and we will withdraw from your space and trouble you no further. If you attack us again, we will respond again, and we will not be as gentle as we have been today. This is your only warning. The recording ended. Doran sat in silence, staring at the wall of his small office. As gentle as we have been today. 30,000 ships reduced to 6,000, and that had been the gentle version. The Vantor Empire had accepted the terms. Of course they had. There was nothing else to do. And then, a year later, human communications had gone quiet entirely, and the Empire had told itself a comfortable story. That the humans, having spent themselves in a war they barely survived, had finally collapsed on their own, dying out somewhere beyond the rift where nobody could see it happen. Doran Vex did not believe that story anymore. Not after reading Admiral Wren's message. That had not been the voice of a dying species. That had been the voice of someone showing mercy, and warning that the mercy would not be offered twice. He gathered the data crystals and made his way through the quiet halls of Fleet Command, heading toward the office of Grand Admiral Colvane. It was very late, but he knew the old admiral rarely slept well, especially not so soon after Humanity Day. He was right. Colvane was awake, sitting at his desk reviewing routine reports, when Doran knocked and entered without waiting for a response. "Commander," Colvane said, raising an eyebrow at the late hour, "this had better be important." "It is, sir." Doran placed the data crystals on the desk. "I've spent 3 days reading the full mission logs from the Silence War, not the summaries, the original records." Colvane's face grew still. "And?"
"Sir."
"We did not win that war. We were shown mercy. The humans could have destroyed us completely, and chose not to, and I don't think that choice came from weakness. I think it came from restraint." Colvane was quiet for a long moment. He picked up one of the data crystals and turned it over in his clawed hand, studying it as if it might tell him something new just by looking at it. "I was at Kess Hollow," he said finally, in a voice much quieter than before. "I was a junior tactical officer aboard the battlecruiser Vantor's Glory. I watched 11 of our ships die in the time it takes to draw one breath. I watched the human fleet, so much smaller than ours, tear through formations that had taken years to train and build. And then, when they had every reason to finish us, they stopped." He set the crystal down. "I have never told anyone this, Vex, but I have always believed they let us live. I simply did not want to believe it, because believing it means admitting that our survival for the last 30 years has not been because we were strong enough to defend ourselves. It has been because they allowed it." "Sir, if that's true, then the gravity spike near the rift might mean they have decided the allowance is over." Colvane finished the thought grimly. Before Doran could respond, the comm panel on Colvane's desk chimed with an urgent alert. Colvane answered it immediately. "Grand Admiral, this is Deep Space Station Rel 9, a nervous voice said. "We've lost contact with Patrol Squadron 7. They were on routine sweep near the Kesserine Rift, scheduled to check in 20 minutes ago. No response to hails. Their last transponder ping showed them entering the outer edge of the rift boundary itself, which is against standing orders, sir. They shouldn't have gone that far." "How many ships in the squadron?" 6, sir. Fast scout class." Colvane closed his eyes briefly. "Send a search and rescue team, quietly, and Rel 9. I want hourly reports on any unusual readings from the rift, no matter how small. That is a direct order, and it does not get filed away this time." "Understood, Admiral." The channel closed. Colvane looked at Doran Vex, and for the first time since the young officer had known him, the old Grand Admiral looked genuinely afraid. 6 scout ships do not simply vanish," Colvane said quietly, "not without a trace, not unless something out there wanted them to vanish, and had the power to make it happen quietly." Far beyond the rift, in the deep dark where Patrol Squadron 7 had wandered too close to the edge of human territory, the 6 scout ships drifted in pieces, their crews already recovered by a human search team that had intercepted them before they could send any distress signal. It had not been a battle. The scout ships had simply been surrounded in an instant by 3 human vessels that appeared out of nowhere, their engines disabled with a precise, non-lethal pulse before their crews even understood what was happening. Now, the captured Vantor sailors sat in a comfortable holding area aboard a human support ship, confused, frightened, but unharmed. A human officer entered the room where they were being held. He was young, with kind eyes, and he spoke slowly in careful Vantor standard, a language the humans had clearly spent considerable time learning. "You are not prisoners," he said. "You are guests, for now. No one is going to hurt you. We simply cannot allow you to report our position back to your fleet just yet. Please be patient. In a short time, everything will become clear." The Vantor squadron leader, a young lieutenant named Rissa Cade, stared at the human officer with wide eyes. "You're really them," she whispered. "The humans. You're real." The officer smiled, not unkindly. "We never stopped being real, Lieutenant. We simply stopped announcing ourselves. That changes very soon." Back on Vantor Prime, Grand Admiral Colvane spent the rest of that night awake, staring at star charts, while Commander Doran Vex quietly began preparing every defensive protocol he could justify without causing a full alert. Neither man slept. Both of them understood, in the deep and quiet way that soldiers sometimes understand things before the evidence fully arrives, that something enormous was moving toward them out of the dark, and that 30 years of comfortable celebration was about to come to an end. 3 star systems away, at Fleet Command's forward listening post on the edge of the rift, a young sensor technician named Priya Sol, no relation to the human Sol Defense Force despite the strange coincidence of her name, which she had always found amusing, sat watching her screens in the deep quiet of the night shift. She had been staring at the same empty starfield for 6 hours, bored out of her mind, when something flickered at the very edge of her long-range sensors. She leaned forward, frowning. A shape, just for a moment. Large, very large, and then it was gone again, as if it had never been there at all. She should have filed a report immediately. That was procedure, but she hesitated, remembering how the Rel 9 gravity spike had been dismissed just days earlier, remembering how nobody wanted to hear about strange readings during Humanity Week, how her supervisor had made it clear that unnecessary alerts during the celebration period would not be appreciated. She waited 5 more minutes, watching the empty screen, telling herself it had been a sensor glitch, a piece of space debris, anything ordinary. Nothing appeared again. Finally, reluctantly, she typed up a brief note and filed it in the routine log, the same place where the Rel 9 report had gone, to be quietly ignored. She did not know it yet, but she had just seen the very edge of the human fleet's forward scouting formation, 3 ships so advanced that even a direct sensor lock had only caught them for a fraction of a second before their systems corrected the exposure. She would never know how close she had come to raising the alarm 3 full days before anyone else did. Somewhere out in that same darkness, Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole studied the reports coming in from her own scout ships. Reports confirming that 6 more Vantor patrol vessels had wandered too close and been quietly captured. Reports confirming that Vantor Fleet Command remained largely unaware of the scale of what was approaching, and reports confirming that the celebration on Vantor Prime, ironically named Humanity Day, was still ongoing in smaller festivals across dozens of colony worlds. "They're still celebrating," said her second-in-command, a tall officer named Colonel James Okafor, reading the same reports over her shoulder. "They really believe we're gone." "They want to believe it," Sarah said. "It's easier than the alternative. It means they never have to face what they did, or worry about what it might cost them." "How long until full fleet position, Admiral?" Sarah looked at the star chart, at the long, curving path her fleet had been quietly following for weeks, moving carefully to avoid detection, gathering strength, waiting for exactly the right moment. 4 days, she said. 4 days, and then Vantor Prime is going to understand exactly how wrong they were. Behind her, on the massive display, hundreds of small ship icons moved slowly forward through the dark, a fleet larger and more powerful than anything the galaxy beyond human space had ever seen, closing in on an empire that still believed its greatest enemy was nothing more than a story told to frighten children. They thought humans were legends. The enemy celebrated. Then the human dangerous battleships arrived. By the 2nd day after Patrol Squadron 7 went missing, Grand Admiral Colvane had quietly moved 3 additional battle groups to defensive positions along the border nearest the Kesserine Rift. He told the Emperor's Council it was a routine training exercise, a story nobody questioned too closely, because nobody wanted to think too hard about anything that might spoil the last days of Humanity Week. Banners still hung in the streets of Nel Ashra. Vendors still sold sweets shaped like human skulls, a tasteless tradition that had become popular decades ago and never quite went away. Life continued as if nothing at all was wrong. But inside Fleet Command, a small group of officers now understood that something was very wrong indeed. Commander Doran Vex had barely slept in 2 days. He spent every free moment analyzing sensor logs from every listening post along the border, searching for anything unusual, any pattern that might explain the missing patrol squadron or the strange gravity readings from before. It was on the morning of the third day that he found what he had been looking for, buried in a routine log filed by a night shift technician named Priya Sol. The entry was brief, almost apologetic in tone. Possible sensor anomaly, large contact, duration under 2 seconds, no confirmation, likely debris or equipment malfunction, filed for record only. Doran stared at the timestamp and the coordinates for a long time. Then he pulled up the full sensor data attached to the report, the raw information that Priya Sol had not bothered to analyze deeply because she assumed it was nothing. He ran it through every filter and comparison tool available to him. What he found made his hands go cold. The shape in the sensor data was enormous. Based on the brief reading, whatever had appeared and disappeared in less than 2 seconds was easily 3 times the size of the largest Vantor battleship in the fleet. And it had been moving in formation with at least 2 other objects of similar size, both of which had vanished from sensors just as quickly, as if something had actively corrected the exposure the moment it was detected. He requested to see Grand Admiral Colvane immediately. "This is not debris," Doran said, spreading the data across Colvane's desk. "Debris does not move in formation. Debris does not vanish from sensors the instant it is detected, as if it knows it has been seen and is actively working to hide again. Sir, I believe we detected human vessels, and I believe there is more than one of them, and I believe they are very close to our border." Colvane studied the data in silence. His scarred face gave away nothing, but his claws, resting on the edge of his desk, had curled tightly into the wood, leaving small marks that had not been there before. "How large would a ship need to be?" Colvane asked slowly. "To produce a sensor signature 3 times the size of the Ashra's Pride. Based on standard scaling for a vessel that size, sir, we would be looking at something in the range of 4 to 5 kilometers in length, possibly larger if the reading was distorted by whatever stealth technology they were using to correct their exposure so quickly." Colvane sat back in his chair. "The largest Vantor warship ever built, the Emperor's Glory, a ceremonial flagship rarely used in actual combat, measured just under 1.5 kilometers. "Get me Fleet Command's Tactical Council," Colvane said quietly. "All of them, now. And Vex, I want you there too. This is your discovery. You should be the one to present it." The Tactical Council met within the hour. A group of 12 senior officers gathered around a long table in a secure room deep beneath Fleet Command headquarters. Most of them looked annoyed at being pulled away from Humanity Week celebrations for what several of them clearly assumed would be a minor administrative matter. That mood changed quickly once Doran Vex began presenting his findings. "This is absurd," said Fleet Marshal Bressa Kane, the most senior officer present after Colvane himself, a heavy-set Vantor with an old-fashioned distrust of anything that challenged established thinking, a 2-second sensor ghost from a junior night shift technician. "You want us to believe this proves the humans have returned, after 30 years of silence, with ships 5 times larger than anything we have ever built? This is exactly the kind of overreaction I would expect from an officer who has spent too much time reading old war stories, instead of doing his actual duties." "Marshal, with respect," Doran said, keeping his voice level despite the insult. "A 2-second sensor ghost, combined with an unexplained gravity anomaly at Rel 9 4 days ago, combined with the complete disappearance of Patrol Squadron 7, 6 ships and 31 crew members, without a single distress signal, without a single piece of recoverable debris, is not something we should be dismissing so quickly." "Patrol squadrons have gone missing before," Kane said dismissively. "Equipment failures, navigation errors, it happens." "All 6 ships at once, Marshal? All experienced crews, all with functioning long-range communication arrays, and not one single distress call among them?" Kane's face darkened, but before he could respond, Grand Admiral Colvane raised a hand for silence. "Enough," Colvane said. "I was at Kess Hollow, Marshal Kane. Were you?" The room went quiet. Kane, visibly uncomfortable, shook his head slowly. "I was too young, Admiral. I know it only from the histories." "Then let me tell you something. The histories do not fully capture," Colvane said, his voice growing hard. "I watched a human fleet of 800 ships defeat a combined alliance force of 30,000 vessels in under 2 hours. I watched it happen with my own eyes, from the bridge of a ship that barely survived the engagement. The humans who did that did not need ships 5 kilometers long to accomplish it. Their vessels at Kess Hollow were, if anything, smaller than our own. If they have returned now with ships of the size Commander Vex describes, then whatever we faced 30 years ago was only the beginning of what they were capable of building. I do not intend to find out the hard way whether that is true, simply because it is inconvenient during a week of celebration. The room fell into a heavy silence. Even Marshal Kane had nothing to say. I am ordering a full alert status for the entire border fleet, Colvane continued. All patrol squadrons are to return to defensive formation. All reserve fleets are to be activated and moved to readiness positions. I want the Emperor informed immediately, and I want every planetary defense grid in the outer systems brought to full operational status within 12 hours. Admiral, the Emperor will not be pleased to have Humanity Week disrupted by what may still turn out to be nothing, said another officer cautiously. Then the Emperor can be displeased with me, Colvane said. I would rather explain an unnecessary alert to an angry Emperor than explain an unprepared fleet to a graveyard full of dead soldiers. This meeting is over. Move. The officers scattered to their duties, some grumbling, most simply grim and quiet, finally beginning to understand the weight of what might be coming. Doran Vex remained behind for a moment as the room emptied. Thank you for believing me, sir, he said. Don't thank me yet, Colvane replied, staring at the star chart on the wall, at the long dark stretch of space between Vantor Prime and the Kesserine Rift. If you are right, Commander, thanking me will be the last thing on your mind very soon. The alert spread through the fleet quickly but quietly, an attempt to prepare without causing public panic during the final days of Humanity Week. Ships that had been decorated with festival lights for the celebration were hastily stripped of decorations and moved back into defensive formations. Reserve crews, many of whom had been enjoying leave to celebrate with their families, were recalled to duty with terse, unexplained orders. It was Patrol Squadron 11, one of the first units to return to active border duty, that made first contact. Squadron 11 consisted of 8 modern frigates, well-armed and well-crewed, patrolling a section of border space roughly 200 kilometers from the edge of the Kesserine Rift. Their commander, a capable young officer named Lieutenant Commander Bryn Ashel, had been briefed only that unusual activity had been detected near the rift, and that increased vigilance was required. She had not been told the full details of what Doran Vex had discovered, only enough to keep her sharp. It was sharp enough. Her sensor officer detected the contact almost immediately, a single vessel, moving slowly, deliberately, as if it wanted to be seen this time. Contact bearing 270, distance 80,000 kilometers, the sensor officer reported, his voice tight with tension. Ma'am, this thing is huge. Reading suggests a length of approximately 4.2 kilometers. It's not accelerating, it's not evading, it's just sitting there. Bryn Ashel stared at the display, her mouth suddenly dry. 4.2 kilometers, nearly 3 times the size of her entire squadron combined. She thought about the warning she had received, the vague mention of unusual activity, and suddenly it did not seem vague at all. Hail it, she ordered, standard first contact protocol. Identify ourselves, request identification in return. The comm officer worked quickly. Message sent, ma'am. No response. They waited. The massive shape remained motionless on the sensor display, close enough now to be visible through the forward viewport as well, a long dark silhouette against the stars, its surface unlike anything Bryn Ashel had ever seen, smooth and curved and strangely organic, without the sharp angles and visible weapon emplacements typical of Vantor military design. Ma'am, the comm officer said suddenly, we're receiving something. Not a standard hail response. It's a data packet, encrypted, but it decrypted itself automatically the moment it hit our systems. I don't understand how that's possible. Play it! A voice came through the bridge speakers, calm, clear, speaking fluent Vantor standard, with only the faintest unfamiliar accent. This is a scouting vessel of the Sol Defense Force. We are aware of your presence, and mean you no immediate harm. We advise you to withdraw to your standard patrol boundary and report this contact to your command. Any hostile action on your part will be met with proportional response. We do not wish for this meeting to become another mistake like the one that started our last war. Please, Choose differently this time. The bridge went utterly silent. Bryn Aishel felt her heart pounding in her chest. This was real. This was actually happening. The humans, the legend, the ghost story her grandmother used to tell her as a child, were sitting less than 80,000 kilometers away, calmly warning her not to attack them. "Ma'am, orders?" the weapons officer asked, his hand hovering nervously near his console. Every instinct in Bryn Aishel's training told her to open fire, to strike first, before the massive unknown vessel could bring its full power to bear. But she remembered the words from the message, a mistake like the one that started our last war. She thought of the countless stories, exaggerated or not, of what had happened to the fleets who struck first 30 years ago. "Hold fire," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "All ships, hold fire. Comm officer, send this message to Fleet Command immediately. Highest priority. Unencrypted if you have to. I don't care. Just get it there fast. Confirmed human contact. Single vessel. 4 kilometers in length. Near border sector 7. They are not attacking. Repeat, they are not attacking. Requesting immediate instructions. Sending now, ma'am." Slowly, carefully, Squadron 11 began to withdraw, never taking their sensors off the massive silent shape that remained exactly where it was, watching them go without making any move to follow. It was not until they were well clear, several minutes later, that the shape finally turned and glided back toward the darkness of the rift, vanishing from sensors as smoothly and silently as it had appeared. Bryn Aishel sat back in her command chair, breathing hard, and realized her hands were shaking. "They let us go," her sensor officer said quietly, disbelief plain in his voice. "They could have destroyed us in seconds, and they just let us go." "They're not here to destroy patrol squadrons," Bryn Aishel said, though she was not entirely sure how she knew that. "I think that was a warning. I think they wanted us to see them, and to report it, and to understand exactly what is coming." At Fleet Command headquarters, the message from Squadron 11 arrived within minutes, and this time, nobody dismissed it. Grand Admiral Colvane read the report 3 times in complete silence before finally looking up at Commander Doran Vex, who stood waiting anxiously nearby. "You were right," Colvane said quietly, "about all of it." "Sir, what do we do now?" Colvane looked at the star chart, at the small marker showing the location of the confirmed contact. So close to Vantor space, so close to everything the Empire had spent 30 years believing was safe. "Now," Colvane said heavily, "we stop pretending Humanity Week is a celebration of something that ended. We prepare for the possibility that it never truly ended at all. Sound the fleet-wide alert. Full mobilization. Every ship, every station, every soldier. I want the entire border fleet gathered at Vantor Prime within 24 hours. And the Emperor, sir." Colvane picked up the comm panel with a grim expression. The Emperor is about to have his celebration interrupted in the worst possible way. Far beyond the border, aboard her flagship, Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole received a brief report from the scouting vessel that had made contact with Squadron 11. She read it carefully, then nodded to herself. "They held their fire," she said to Colonel Okafor. "Good. That tells us something important. There's still restraint in them, even after 30 years of believing we were dead. That's worth remembering when this is over." "They'll be mobilizing their entire fleet now, Admiral. The element of surprise is gone." Sarah Cole allowed herself a small, tired smile. "We were never trying to surprise them, James. We were trying to give them one last chance to see us coming, and choose peace before we arrived. Whether they take that chance or not is up to them now." She turned to face the main display, where the full strength of the human fleet stretched out behind her scouting vessels like a wall of dark stars, waiting, patient, and utterly prepared. "Signal the fleet. Begin final approach to Vantor Prime." It's time they understood exactly what 30 years of silence really meant. They thought humans were legends, the enemy celebrated. Then the human dangerous battleships arrived. The final banners of Humanity Week were still being taken down in the streets of Nel Ashra when the alert sirens began to sound across Vantor Prime. At first, many citizens assumed it was some kind of festival event, a dramatic closing ceremony perhaps, and some even cheered when the deep warning tones echoed across the capital city. That confusion did not last long. Within minutes, official broadcasts interrupted every channel, ordering all citizens to seek shelter immediately, and the cheerful mood of the past week curdled instantly into fear. Above the planet, the full strength of the Vantorian home fleet had gathered in a matter of hours, a desperate effort that stretched every available resource to its limit. Over 4,000 warships now hung in defensive formation around Vantor Prime, the largest single gathering of Vantor military power in the Empire's history. Grand Admiral Colvane stood on the bridge of the Ashra's Pride, watching the tactical display with a grim expression, while beside him, Commander Doran Vex monitored incoming sensor data from the outer picket ships. "Sir," Doran said, his voice tight, "outer sensor network is picking up multiple large contacts approaching from the direction of the rift, confirmed count, currently at 40, but the number keeps rising as more come into range." Size comparison to the vessel Squadron 11 encountered. Doran checked his readings again, his hands trembling slightly despite his best efforts to remain steady. "Similar, sir. Several appear even larger. I'm reading multiple contacts in excess of 5 kilometers in length. There's also a large formation of smaller vessels, likely escort craft, though even the smallest of these are still larger than our own frigates." Colvane closed his eyes briefly. 4,000 Vantor warships, gathered from every corner of the Empire, and it suddenly felt like nowhere near enough. How long until they reach the planet? At their current speed, approximately 2 hours, sir. 2 hours. Colvane thought of everything that needed to happen in that time. Evacuation shelters needed to be filled. Planetary defense grids needed to be brought to full power. And somewhere in the palace at the heart of Nel Ashra, the Emperor needed to decide what kind of empire the Vantor people were going to be remembered as. One that had learned from 30 years ago, or one that had learned nothing at all. The Emperor's decision came within the hour, delivered through a formal channel to every ship in the fleet. All Vantor forces were ordered to establish a defensive perimeter and to hold fire unless directly fired upon. There would be no repeat of the mistake that had started the Silence War 30 years ago. If the humans wished to talk, the Empire would listen. If they wished to fight, the Empire would defend itself, but it would not be the one to strike first this time. Colvane felt a small measure of relief reading those orders. It was, he thought, perhaps the wisest decision the current Emperor had ever made. 2 hours passed slowly, tensely, the entire fleet holding position in tight defensive formation, every crew watching their sensors, waiting, and then, exactly on schedule, the human fleet arrived. They did not appear gradually, the way a fleet using conventional engines might. One moment the space beyond Vantor Prime's outer defensive perimeter was empty. The next it was filled with ships, hundreds of them, arranged in a formation so precise it looked almost artistic. A great curved wall of dark hulls stretching across a significant portion of the sky. At the center of the formation floated the largest vessel any Vantor eye had ever seen, a ship easily 8 kilometers in length, its surface smooth and dark, catching the distant light of Vantor Prime's sun in strange patterns that seemed to shift and flow like water. Across 4,000 Vantor ships, a stunned, terrified silence fell. "By the ancestors," Colvane whispered, staring at the massive flagship on his display. 30 years. Look what they built in 30 years. "Sir," Doran said quietly, "we're receiving a transmission. Fleet-wide broadcast, addressed to all Vantor forces and to the Emperor directly. Play it, everywhere. Let the whole planet hear it." A voice came through, calm and measured, the same voice that had spoken to Squadron 11 days earlier, though everyone listening now understood it belonged to someone of much higher authority. "This is Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole of the Sol Defense Force, speaking on behalf of the human race. 30 years ago, your empire attacked our people without provocation, and when we defended ourselves, your empire continued that war for 3 years, at a cost of tens of thousands of your own ships and countless lives, rather than accept the peace we offered from the very first battle. We won that war completely. We could have ended your empire entirely at Kess Hollow. We chose not to. We withdrew instead, and we spent these 30 years building and preparing, not for conquest, but so that if this moment ever came again, we would never have to fight it with anything less than absolute certainty of the outcome." The voice paused, letting the words settle across the frightened fleet and the terrified planet below. "We are not here to destroy Vantor Prime. We are here because your empire chose to abandon the peace terms of this alert entirely. Once, 30 years ago, believing your numbers would eventually overcome us. We are here to ensure that mistake is never repeated, by you or by anyone watching what happens here today. You will stand down your fleet. You will accept binding terms of peace, terms far more permanent than the ones you broke before. If you comply, no shot needs to be fired, and no life needs to be lost today. If you do not comply, we will demonstrate, clearly and completely, exactly why that would be a catastrophic mistake. The choice is yours, and it always has been. The transmission ended. On the bridge of the Ashra's Pride, nobody spoke for a long moment. "Sir," Doran said finally, "the Emperor is on the priority channel. He wants your assessment before he responds." Colvane took a slow breath. "Tell him this, Commander, word for word. Tell him I was at Kess Hollow. Tell him I watched 30,000 ships become 6,000 in under 2 hours, and that fleet in front of us now looks stronger by an order of magnitude than the one that did that to us 30 years ago. Tell him that if he wants my honest military opinion, engaging that fleet is not a battle we can win. It is a battle we can only lose slowly or lose quickly, and I would rather lose nothing at all." The channel to the Emperor's palace remained open for several long, agonizing minutes. Colvane could imagine the scene there. The Emperor surrounded by his council, Marshal Kane likely still arguing for a defensive stance rather than surrender, old pride warring with new fear. And then, before any response came from the palace, everything changed. It happened on the far edge of the Vantor Formation. A single reserve squadron commanded by a young, frightened captain named Vesa Dorn, a squadron that had not received the Emperor's hold-fire order clearly, due to a communications relay failure during the chaotic mobilization of the past day. Seeing the massive human fleet arrive, and terrified beyond rational thought by the size of what confronted her, Captain Dorn made a desperate, catastrophic decision. She ordered her squadron of 12 frigates to open fire on the nearest human escort vessel. 12 ships fired everything they had in a single coordinated volley, and for one terrible moment, Colvane's blood ran cold, certain that this single act of panic had just doomed the entire planet. The response, when it came, was almost gentle by comparison to what Colvane had feared. The targeted human escort vessel simply activated some kind of defensive field, a shimmering curtain of pale light that absorbed the entire volley without visible damage. Then, calmly, without any apparent anger or urgency, 3 precise beams of blue-white light lanced out from the human ship, and Captain Dorn's 12 frigates went dark and silent, their weapons and engines disabled in a single coordinated strike, though remarkably, scans confirmed moments later that no lives had been lost. The ships simply drifted, powerless, their crews alive but helpless. Admiral Sarah Cole's voice returned over the fleet-wide channel, still calm, though with a slight edge now. "That was a mistake, not an act of war on your empire's part. We recognize the difference, and we have responded accordingly. 12 of your ships are disabled, but your people are unharmed. Consider this your only demonstration. The next mistake, intentional or not, will not be answered so gently. Grand Admiral Colvane, I know you can hear this. I have read your service record from the Silence War. I know you were at Kess Hollow, and I believe you understand better than anyone what I am trying to prevent from happening here today. Help your Emperor make the right choice." Colvane stared at the display, stunned that the human admiral knew his name, had apparently studied his own history the way Doran Vex had studied theirs. He activated the channel to the palace immediately. "Your Majesty," Colvane said, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. "You have just seen exactly what happens when even a small mistake is made against this fleet. They disabled 12 ships without killing a single crew member, when they could have destroyed all 12 in an instant. That restraint is not weakness. It is a demonstration of exactly how much power they are choosing not to use. I beg you, do not test how far that restraint extends. Accept the terms. End this before it becomes something none of us can undo." There was a long pause on the channel, the Emperor's breathing audible, heavy with the weight of a decision that would define the future of the entire Vantorian Empire. "And if I refuse, Admiral?" the Emperor asked quietly. "If I order the fleet to fight?" Colvane looked at the tactical display, at 4,000 Vantor ships against a human fleet that had just disabled 12 vessels with 3 precisely placed beams of light, almost as an afterthought. while making it clear that this had been a mercy rather than their true capability. "Then I believe, Your Majesty, that within a matter of hours there will be no Vantorian Empire left for anyone to remember, and 30 years from now, some other species will be telling stories about us, the way we once told stories about them." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Down in the palace, the Emperor closed his eyes, thinking of the golden years of the Empire, of conquest and pride and the comfortable belief that the Vantor people were among the strongest in the galaxy. He thought of the fireworks over Nel Ashra just days earlier, the joyful crowd celebrating a victory that, he now understood with sickening clarity, had never truly been a victory at all. It had been mercy, extended by a species patient enough to wait 30 years to see if that mercy would be honored or wasted. "Open a direct channel to Admiral Cole," the Emperor said finally, his voice heavy but steady. "Tell the fleet to power down all weapon systems immediately. Tell them we are ready to listen." Aboard the Ashra's Pride, Grand Admiral Colvane closed his eyes and allowed himself, for the first time in days, a small breath of genuine relief. Beside him, Commander Doran Vex relayed the order to power down weapons across the fleet, his hands finally steady again. "We just avoided a second Kess Hollow," Doran said quietly. "We avoided our own destruction," Colvane corrected. "Kess Hollow was a battle we survived. Barely. This would not have been survivable at all." He looked out at the massive human fleet, still holding its position with perfect, patient discipline, waiting to see if the Empire would truly stand down. 30 years, Vex. 30 years we told ourselves a comfortable story so we would not have to face an uncomfortable truth. I wonder how many other empires across this galaxy are telling themselves similar stories right now, about enemies they assume are gone simply because they have gone quiet. "What happens now, sir?" Colvane watched as, across the vast human formation, the great flagship began to move slowly forward, escorted by a smaller group of vessels, approaching the Vantor fleet not as an attacking force, but as a delegation, preparing to negotiate terms. "Now," Colvane said, "we find out exactly what kind of peace 30 years of patience has decided to offer us. And Commander, I sincerely hope, for the sake of every soul on this planet, that we have finally learned enough to accept it properly this time." Behind them, on the great tactical display, the icon representing Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole's flagship continued its slow, deliberate approach toward Vantor Prime, a single enormous ship carrying 30 years of restraint, patience, and quiet preparation, arriving at last to finish a conversation the Vantorian Empire had refused to properly have 3 decades before. They thought humans were legends, the enemy celebrated. Then the human dangerous battleships arrived. The human flagship, a vessel the crew of the Ashra's Pride had already begun quietly calling the Mountain, due to its immense size, settled into a stable position just outside the main Vantor defensive perimeter. It did not approach any closer than agreed. It did not power any weapons. It simply waited, patient and enormous, while a small shuttle detached from its underside and made its way toward the surface of Vantor Prime, carrying Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole and a small honor guard toward the palace of Nel Ashra, where the Emperor himself had agreed to meet her in person. Grand Admiral Colvane was summoned to attend the meeting, along with Commander Doran Vex, whose research had, in the end, given the Empire just enough warning to avoid a far greater catastrophe. Colvane insisted that Vex accompany him, a decision the young officer would remember gratefully for the rest of his long career. The palace hall where the meeting took place had, only a week earlier, been decorated for the final celebrations of Humanity Week. Some of the banners had not yet been fully removed, and there was a strange, uncomfortable irony in negotiating the future of an empire beneath decorations that had celebrated the assumed extinction of the very people now walking through the doors. Sarah Cole entered with quiet dignity, dressed in a simple dark uniform without unnecessary decoration, flanked by a small group of human officers who watched the room with calm, professional alertness rather than open hostility. She was younger than Colvane had expected, though her eyes carried the weight of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. The Emperor rose to greet her personally, a gesture of respect that surprised several members of his own council, who had expected him to remain seated to preserve some symbolic sense of authority. "Admiral Cole," the Emperor said, his voice carefully controlled, 30 years ago, my predecessor believed your people had been destroyed. I confess, I believed it too, until very recently. I owe you, and my own people, an apology for the arrogance of that belief. Apologies are a good beginning, Your Majesty, Sarah said, but they are not what brought us here today. Terms are. She gestured, and one of her officers placed a data tablet on the table between them. The Emperor accepted it cautiously. The terms are simpler than you might expect, Sarah continued. We do not want your territory. We do not want tribute, or resources, or control over your government. What we want is verification and accountability. A permanent monitoring station will be established at the Kesserine Rift, jointly staffed by Vantor and human personnel, to ensure early warning of any future conflict on either side, before it can escalate into something like what happened 30 years ago. Your empire will formally recognize human territory beyond the rift as sovereign, and will cease all military patrols beyond the agreed boundary line, just as we agree to respect your borders in turn. And finally, this history, the full and true history of the Silence War, including the details of how it began and how it ended, will be made available to your people, not hidden away in classified archives that only a handful of scholars ever bother to read. Colvane glanced sideways at Doran Vex, who looked faintly surprised, and perhaps a little proud, at that last term. That is all? The Emperor asked, clearly having expected far harsher demands, perhaps the dismantling of the Vantor military entirely, or the payment of crushing reparations. That is all, Sarah confirmed. We are not interested in punishing your entire species for the mistakes of a government that acted out of fear 30 years ago, and again more recently, when a frightened captain fired on our escort ship before your alert order reached her. Fear makes people do foolish things. We understand that better than most, Your Majesty. What we want is not vengeance. It is simply to ensure that fear never leads to this kind of mistake again, on either side. The Emperor studied the terms for a long moment, then looked up. And if I refuse these terms? Sarah Cole's expression did not change, but something in her eyes grew colder, more distant. Then we return to a state of war that your empire cannot win. Your Majesty, I would prefer not to demonstrate that a second time. The first demonstration, 30 years ago, should have been more than sufficient. I am hopeful it will not require a third. The Emperor was silent for a long moment, glancing at Grand Admiral Colvane, seeking some final measure of counsel before committing his entire empire to a new path. Admiral Colvane, the Emperor said, your recommendation. Colvane stepped forward, standing straighter than he had in years. Your Majesty, I have spent 30 years believing that our survival after the Silence War was proof of our strength. I have learned, in the past several days, that it was instead proof of their mercy. I do not believe that mercy is limitless. I recommend we accept these terms, not out of fear, though I confess there is plenty of that in me as well, but because they are fair terms, offered by a people who clearly could have demanded far more, and chose not to. That restraint deserves to be honored with good faith of our own. The Emperor nodded slowly, then turned back to Sarah Cole. The Vantorian Empire accepts your terms, Admiral, fully, and without reservation. Sarah allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the first real warmth she had shown since entering the hall. Thank you, Your Majesty. I believe this is the beginning of something better than either of our peoples have known before. As the formal signing of the agreement proceeded, Colvane found himself standing near one of the tall windows, looking out over the city of Nel Ashra, where the last of the Humanity Week banners still fluttered in the evening wind. He was joined a moment later by Sarah Cole herself, who had stepped away from the main gathering for a brief moment of quiet. Your city celebrates our supposed death every year, Sarah said, not unkindly, following his gaze. I confess, it is a strange thing to witness. I imagine it must be, Colvane admitted. I am sorry for that. It seemed harmless once, a story to comfort ourselves with. Comfortable stories are dangerous things, Admiral. They let people stop paying attention to uncomfortable truths. She turned to look at him directly. Your officer, Commander Vex, is the one who found the truth in our old records, correct? The one who refused to accept the comfortable version of the war. He is. He reminds me of some of our own historians. People willing to dig through the parts of the story nobody wants to remember, Because they understand that forgetting is how mistakes get repeated. Sarah paused. Tell him something for me, Admiral, if you would. Tell him that curiosity like his is exactly the kind of thing that prevents wars, far more often than any fleet of battleships ever could. We only needed the battleships today because his warning came in time for both sides to still choose peace, rather than have it forced upon them after the fighting had already begun. Colvane nodded, quietly moved by the sentiment. I will tell him. Elsewhere in the city, far from the palace, Professor Mira Vex sat in her small office, surrounded by the same old books and data crystals she had studied for 40 years, watching a live broadcast of the historic agreement being signed between the Vantorian Empire and the Sol Defense Force. Her student Tarn sat beside her, watching in stunned silence. You were right, Tarn said quietly, about all of it. The humans, the war, everything. I take no pleasure in being right about this, Tarn, Mira said softly. I only hoped that someone in power would eventually listen before it was too late. It seems, for once, that someone did. What happens now, Professor? Mira considered the question for a long moment, watching the broadcast show Admiral Cole and the Emperor shaking hands in front of a room full of cameras, an image that would be replayed across every news channel in Vantor space for years to come. Now, she said, the real work begins. Not the work of fighting, but the work of understanding. Two peoples who spent 30 years believing very different stories about each other must now learn to share the truth instead. That is harder than any battle, Tarn, and it takes far longer than a single afternoon of negotiation, but it is work worth doing. In the weeks that followed, the terms of the agreement were carried out with remarkable speed. Construction began on the joint monitoring station at the Kesserine Rift, staffed by an equal number of Vantor and human personnel, an arrangement that felt awkward and tense at first, but gradually, slowly, began to develop into something resembling genuine cooperation. The full, true history of the Silence War was released to the Vantor public, causing a wave of shock and reflection across the Empire, as millions of citizens learned for the first time that their ancestors had started a war they had no right to start, and had been shown a mercy they had not fully earned. Humanity Day, the annual celebration that had once marked the assumed extinction of humanity, was formally ended by imperial decree. In its place, a new day of remembrance was established, one dedicated not to celebrating an enemy's supposed destruction, but to honoring the peace that had finally been achieved, and to remembering the cost of the assumptions that had nearly led to a second, far more devastating war. Commander Doran Vex was promoted for his role in uncovering the truth in time, and he went on to become one of the founding officers of the new joint monitoring station, working alongside human counterparts he had once only read about in old, frightening war stories. He found, much to his own surprise, that many of them were not so different from himself, curious, dedicated people who simply wanted to understand the universe a little better and prevent unnecessary suffering wherever they could. Grand Admiral Colvane retired from active fleet command a year later, spending his final years advising the new Joint Council on matters of Vantor human relations, a role he approached with the quiet, thoughtful care of a man who had once believed himself a survivor of a terrible war, only to learn he had actually been the recipient of a great and undeserved kindness. Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole returned to human space, where she would spend the coming years helping to establish similar agreements with other species across the galaxy, some of whom, much like the Vantor Empire, had spent decades believing comfortable stories about enemies who had simply chosen patience over vengeance. Word of what had happened at Vantor Prime spread slowly across the stars, carried by traders and diplomats and cautious scouts from a dozen different empires, all of them beginning to understand a simple, sobering truth. Humanity had never truly disappeared. It had simply been waiting, quietly, patiently, for the galaxy to decide whether it had learned anything at all from the mistakes of the past. And on Vantor Prime, in the great hall where the treaty had been signed, a small plaque was eventually placed on the wall, a simple inscription that Grand Admiral Colvane himself had requested, translated carefully into both Vantor Standard and Human English, so that neither people would ever forget the lesson learned on the day the legends finally arrived. Fear makes enemies of strangers. Understanding makes neighbors of enemies. Let this peace be remembered, not as a victory for either side, but as the moment both sides finally chose to listen. Far above the planet, in the quiet dark beyond the Kesserine Rift, the great human fleet that had once arrived as an unstoppable wall of dark ships slowly withdrew, ship by ship, back toward the space they called home, their patient 30-year vigil finally at an end, replaced now by something new, fragile and hopeful, the slow, uncertain, but genuine beginning of peace between two peoples who had once believed the only story worth telling about each other was one of fear.